Does the Gospel of John describe Jesus as God? Yes. Now, popular religious content creator Dan McClellan doesn't think so, and to get to that conclusion, he has to jump through a lot of different hoops. But we're going to remove those hoops and shine a light on what John actually says, so let's dive in.
There is no part of the Gospel of John that describes Jesus as the very God of Israel.
The consensus among scholars is that yes, John describes Jesus as God. The majority of scholars have been saying this for a long time, and yes, that was a terrible argument that doesn't add to the discussion at all. But I use it in order to highlight a common tactic that Dan uses, appeals to the consensus or the majority of scholars, when it suits his rhetorical goals. It's important to realize the sort of arguments that people use so that we can evaluate whether or not it is credible, and we will dive much more into this as we go through this massive video. And just a heads up, this will be done in sections because his video is close to 40 minutes long and I'm exceptionally wordy, so the final product, well, it's going to be much more than that. But this should really set the record straight here.
And the Christological framework that makes the most sense of every syllable of the Gospel of John is not a Trinitarian framework. It's not a divine identity framework. It's more of a divine agency framework, specifically a hybrid logos/image Christological framework.
So the first question that we have to ask is, should we expect one framework to explain every syllable in the Gospel of John? I don't think so. I don't think that's something that we should expect. So let's assume for the moment that what we have in John is a Trinitarian framework. If that is true, we still have some issues, because when we are looking at Trinitarian theology, it's something that is still being developed. It would be an incomplete framework, meaning that yes, there will be portions that this framework could not fully explain. There are still going to be portions that aren't fully fleshed out that will need to be developed over the next few centuries. This is why we don't see just one singular Christological framework when it comes to John. But let's take a short pause here, because everyone may not understand what we are discussing when we are talking about Christology. To put it simply, this is the study of Christ. This is a theological study where the nature of Jesus is really thought about. What does it mean for him to be human? What does it mean for him to be divine? And what is his role in salvation and the like? This then breaks down really into two main views: a low Christology, which emphasizes the humanity of Jesus, and a high Christology that really focuses on the divine nature of Christ. The Gospel of John has historically been seen as being more in the high Christology camp. The Trinity often falls more in this camp as well. With that said, though, in John, since this Christology is still developing, what we really see are multiple Christological frameworks being applied. John is taking ideas from here and there, and then he's beginning to work through them. So in John, we have a handful of different frameworks that are at play. At the beginning, we have this logos or wisdom Christology, which most likely is developing out of a binitarian view within Judaism, and we will dive more into that before we are done here. But basically within Judaism, during this time period, we have what we could describe as an idea that there were extensions of God. They were still within the image and the being of God, but they were distinct in some way as well. So think of the divine wisdom in the Old Testament, or even the Spirit of God. The Logos gets incorporated into this view as well, and then Jesus gets rolled up into this view too. We also have the view that Dan takes, which is this divine agency framework. He's the agent of God who speaks for and does the work of God. He's authorized by God to do much of what God himself would do. There is also this son-father sort of relational Christology. It's similar to the Logos idea, but it's also distinct. It still relates Jesus to God in some manner, but it's a father-son dynamic. Then there is also this exaltation or resurrection Christology, where you have this definite change with Jesus, this metaphysical transformation of Jesus into Christ. Different scholars will reflect on these differently. They will use different terminology. Some will add additional forms of Christology here, some fewer, but really what we see is a layered approach instead of a uniform approach. And this is why we see some tension within the Gospel of John, because he's not attempting to smooth this all out. It's still a developing framework. So to try to boil it down to just one view doesn't work. It gets us off to a bad start by really presenting an either-or fallacy. It's either your framework or it's my framework, when in reality it's more of a both-and situation, in that both your framework and mine are present plus a few others. So we are just getting off to a bad start here.
And I'm going to go through all of the relevant passages in the Gospel of John and explain why a hybrid logos/image Christology best accounts for all of the data.
And we're going to go with him and explain how the methodology that he's employing is suspect at best, while diving more into this topic. The major issue that we start with before even moving into this passage is that Dan is already blurring the lines. He's hedging his bets by making it seem as if only one Christological framework is needed, but then he introduces this hybrid model, which is in effect at least two different Christological frameworks. He's already backing away from his initial claim. He's taking a weaker stance by acknowledging that the Christology in John is not so straightforward, that it's not a unified picture, meaning it's not just one framework that explains all of the data, but multiple different frameworks. And if we're going to allow for that, what stops a person from using a different sort of hybrid approach? Why not a Trinitarian and image Christology hybrid, or a hybrid of the four types of Christological frameworks that I supplied above? If we are accepting that one framework in and of itself doesn't explain everything, then how can he simply dismiss the Trinitarian framework because it doesn't make sense of every single syllable? Dan is invalidating his argument before he even begins here, and in fact he's validating our own argument that points out that there are different frameworks at play, which we will continue to point out.
This is John 1:1. This is the translation from the updated edition of the New Revised Standard Version. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, this is not a great translation because it uses capital G, God, as the predicates in this predication.
We will dive into all of this grammar in just a bit, and I will try to break it down as much as possible. This is one of the big issues that I have with Dan, though. It's that he doesn't simplify this terminology for people who aren't in the field. Now, to be fair, in this case, it's better than other times, but if we want to be religious communicators, we need to be aware that the general public isn't going to know a lot of this jargon or the technical terms that we use. Because why should they? It's the same way within every single field. Unless you're in that field, you probably don't know their jargon as it's field specific. Now, my biggest problem with this is that it often acts like an appeal to authority. They can spit out these technical terms, which will then make it appear more academic and often more trustworthy. And since those listening to all this don't fully understand what is being said, they also can't really question it in any way. We simply need to be willing to break it down a bit so that we aren't gatekeeping information behind language. Beyond that, the translation we see here is pretty standard. It's used throughout the Revised Standard Version tradition, which includes the edition that he's using. It's in the Jerusalem and the New Jerusalem Bible, which is often highly rated. It's in the New American Standard Bible, the New International Version. It was in the King James Bible and the updated versions of that. We see it in Catholic translations, evangelical translations, scholarly translations. We see it in the early English Bibles, from the Tyndale Bible to the Cloverdale Bible to the Bishop's Bible and the Geneva Bible. We see it being true in both Martin Luther's German Bible as well as the Vulgate. I'm belaboring the point a bit, but the vast majority of Bibles have translated this verse just like this: God with a big G. Now, this really only gets us back to around the 9th century, because it was only then that we see a distinction between capital letters and lowercase letters in a developed way. So really, his argument here is largely that everyone for centuries have been mistranslating this verse because they don't understand Greek properly. Before we move on, let's quickly go over what a predicate though is. It's the part of a sentence that tells us about the subject. We'll get more into this in just a moment though.
And that's not really what the Greek is saying. Here's the Greek, and I've underlined that third clause, ke theos in ho logos.
It is what the Greek is saying. So that third clause there literally translated, reads, "And God, divine, was the Word." Now, we tend to phrase this as the Word was God, divine, though simply because it makes more sense in English. That's just how we do things. Now, I use the word divine here because, well, theos can mean divine, but it usually means God. It's really the dominant use. Now, Dan is going to kind of base his argument off this other use, this idea of divine, but he's also going to point out that prior to theos in the Greek, there is no article, which doesn't really mean anything here, because with this sort of grammatical structure, the article was often dropped, but we will let him continue.
And scholars have noted for a long time that theos here is anarthrous. I'm going to use that word quite a bit in this video, and it means it does not have the definite article.
Sure. Scholars have noticed that there is no definite article here. They have also long realized that a definite article isn't needed as well. For instance, we have Colwell's rule, which points out that in the format that we're looking at, a definite article would or could have been dropped, as is rather a normal thing to do. This would mean that theos here was still seen as something specific, which is why we use a big G here. Now, that doesn't mean that we can always assume that the article was dropped, because there are always exceptions to the rules. So what do we do instead? Well, we examine the entire passage in context. And when we do that, and we will break this down more and more, what we find is that the correct reading of this verse is in fact, the Word was God, big G.
But when you were referring to the God of Israel, except for some syntactical constructions, you usually had the definite article.
So let's be clear on this. Dan recognizes that a definite article isn't always needed, and we see this in a number of different verses within the New Testament as well as with the early Greek church fathers. Dan attempts to minimize this by qualifying that idea by saying that there are exceptions, but only for some syntactical constructions. Or in other words, in some arrangements, some grammatical arrangements, we don't need an article, and it just happens that John 1:1, as per the Colwell's rule, is one such arrangement that doesn't necessarily need an article. So Dan is kind of making my argument for me here.
This is one of those syntactical constructions where you can, or you should, omit the definite article when theos is being used qualitatively, and that's what the majority of scholars agree is going on in this passage.
We need to break this down a bit. So Dan and I agree that an article is not needed here, which is why the majority of scholars and translators read this as the Word was God, big G. We cannot read this as the Word was a God. So what about the claim of it, theos, being qualitative? It would mean that the term theos here is being used more as a quality. What this means when looking at the majority of scholars is that the term theos is describing the nature of the Word, or logos. This would mean that the Word has the same nature as God. The way that this is read is that the Word was God in essence. It's not God the Father, but it's still God in some sense. It shares the divine identity with God. Meaning the correct translation here would still be the Word was God, big G. Dan Wallace in his books, The Basics of New Testament Syntax and Beyond Basics, explains it as John stating that the Word possesses all of the attributes of God and thus can be referred to as God. It shares in the essence of God, but is still distinct from the Father, which makes sense as Logos theology is based on this idea that the Word, Jesus, is an extension of God, is within the divine image of God, but is also distinct from God, which can be somewhat confusing as it's not super spelled out, but as God is somewhat of a mystery or is understood to be such, then we have a bit of mystery that remains in this entire view.
So theos here doesn't mean the God of Israel. It means deity, divine, or a God.
Let's start at the end and work from there. No, it can't mean a God. If we assume that based on the grammatical structure that the definite article can or should be omitted, that means that when we read this, we should assume that we read it as if it did include that article. The reason being, you can't omit something that was never there. So the assumption here is that we are working with a phrase that should be viewed as if it has an article, but because of the structure of the sentence, we just don't include it when writing down the phrase, but we still act as if it's there. That means we can't read this passage as if it states that the Word was a God. And to be clear, this is how the majority of scholars actually see this. The reading "a God" is novel, a unique reading here, which is why I have a problem with how Dan so often appeals to the majority of scholars, or to the consensus, because he states that the majority of scholars see this as being qualitative, and then continues by arguing that it could be seen as a God, which implies that this is what the majority of scholars also believe. It's not. Very few, if any, scholars would actually take this view. Now, this line would really hold with a deity reading as well. To have simply a deity here ignores the same context with a definite article as did the idea of it reading a God. The one possible reading that makes some sense is the term divine. It would still be read "the word was divine" as with a big D. As Dan Wallace explains though, if we take the translation of theos as being more general, being a term for divine, then it only is acceptable based on context if it is applied solely to the true deity, meaning the word would share in the essence of God, possessed all of the attributes of God, and thus could be referred to God with a big G. Dan is not following the data here, he's not following the scholarship, and is creating a unique reading that even his own argument doesn't support.
So the logos, the word, was deity, was divine, or was a God, would be the three most precise translations of what's going on here.
Not even close. Dan's own argument, as we broke down, doesn't even support this reading. For Dan to get to this idea, he has to ignore the context and the grammar of the sentence, and then appeal to a unique reading that stands in contrast to how everyone else has translated this, and in contrast to how this passage was historically understood. He has to argue that in this one case, we have something special going on, where we ignore even the grammar he brought up, so that he can reach a conclusion that he has already decided was correct. It's putting dogma before data. It means he has to reject what the vast majority of scholars argue and have argued for centuries, while also claiming that the vast majority are correct when it suits him. But he doesn't even mention any of those disagreements, he only highlights when there's some sort of agreement, which is deceptive at best.
Now, this does not identify the Logos as the God of Israel. It also doesn't identify the Logos as God the Father.
This is a bit sly. So when we talk about the Spirit of God within Hebrew Scripture, are we talking about God the Father? What about divine wisdom? Well, the answer is no. There is some sense that these ideas are distinct from God. They are extensions of God, so they don't equate fully with God the Father. But they are still extensions of God. They are still within the divine image of God. They are still God in some sense, while also being distinct in some sense. Now, if we look at the Trinity, the claim is never that Jesus, who is being represented by the Logos here, is God the Father. Dan has created a straw man here. He's arguing against a view that isn't being put forth. Yes, the Logos is not equal to God the Father. Jesus is not equal to God the Father. That is never the argument. There is always some sort of distinction, and we have this framework to explain this distinction already present in the Old Testament with concepts like the Spirit of God, which is God in some sense, but also distinct from God. It's an extension of God.
Now, there are folks who are going to argue, like Daniel Wallace and others, that this is still identifying the Word as the God of Israel, just not as the Father.
Other scholars, like the majority of scholars, now I've already explained this prior, and I did cite Dan Wallace here, and when we think of what the Trinity actually teaches, not the straw man Dan has created here, the fact that John is not equating God the Father exactly with Jesus or the Logos makes perfect sense. It's not a problem. It's exactly what the Trinitarian framework states.
And that requires presupposing that the God of Israel exhausted the category of deity for first century Jewish writers.
It's presupposing, based on the available data, that for Jews within the first century, there was just one God. Like the Shema states, Deuteronomy 6:4-9, an affirmation of the oneness of God. We also have Paul in 1 Corinthians 8, where he mentions that sure, there are so-called gods, but for us, there is just one God. Judaism in the first century can be called a complex monotheism, but even those who accepted that other cultures and groups may have had ideas of gods or so-called gods, for them there was just one God worthy of loyalty, of worship, that had true power. Yes, it exhausted their idea of divine or deity because for them, God was the one.
And we have no data that support that conclusion.
The Shema, we have 1 Corinthians with Paul. Paul makes it clear during this time period for Judaism, which Christianity existed in, there was only one God. And this was incredibly important when we put this in context. Now in 1 Corinthians 1:8, what Paul is addressing is the idea of food being sacrificed to other gods. And this mattered because in a place like Corinth, virtually any meat that you would buy would have been involved in this process. Meat that you bought at the market most likely would have been sacrificed to a god. So this is something that these churches are questioning. Can we eat this meat or do we need to keep away from it? Paul says, go ahead, it's okay to eat, because the so-called gods that this meat were sacrificed to, they have no power. They have no real authority or divinity. It's a dismissal of the entire idea, and Paul replaces it with one idea. For us, there is only one God. This was a monotheistic statement, even though it's more of a complex monotheism that he had in mind. What Paul is doing here is something that's rooted within Jewish thought. It's something we see quite a bit within Jewish sources. What we often see is that yes, there were other gods in some sense, but this acknowledgement came with a rejection as well. This occurs throughout the Hebrew Bible. One of the ways that we see this happening is through the downgrading of various gods. We see it by calling them idols or by denying their divinity or even making them subordinate to the Abrahamic God. And at the same time, we have something else that is at play. Our idea of God is expanding. God becomes larger. He is seen to have more qualities, and he eventually engulfs other deities. This leads to a much more complex idea of God, but it also makes him much more unique. It also redefined divinity because for Jews and Christians at this time, full divinity, true divinity, was God's alone. So we have a lot of data that supports this view. What we don't have data for, though, is the idea that Jews were willing to adopt other gods into their viewpoint, that they were open to other deities. For them, there was one God.
In fact, this passage fits right into a tradition that understands the Logos, the Word of God, as a distinct being from the very God of Israel.
So exactly what Trinitarian thought states? Because Trinitarian theology states that while Jesus, or the Logos here, is equal to God, he's still distinct from God. Jesus is not God the Father. That is not what the Trinity states. Instead, again, Jesus is still seen as distinct, and that's the only reason that the whole idea of the Trinity works. Dan is working off a straw man here, which really invalidates his entire argument. Either he doesn't understand what the Trinity is, or he's purposely misrepresenting it. Or I guess maybe his view is based on one of the many bad takes about the Trinity that is in circulation. But either way, it's incredibly poor form to argue against an idea that you have to strawman.
And we see this in Philo of Alexandria prior to the writing of the Gospel of John, and even after the writing of the Gospel of John, we see it in Justin Martyr.
Was the author of the Gospel of John inspired by Philo? Does the Logos theology that John develops appear to be the same as Philo's? No. The fact is, Philo just wasn't really influential within this area until after the New Testament period. He wasn't really influential in the Levant, period. Later on, yes, Christians such as the early church fathers were influenced by the works of Philo, but even then, what we are seeing is a Trinitarian view being implemented here. But we will discuss that a little bit more as the time goes on. The big point is that you can't take material that wouldn't have been influential and act as if it means anything. What we have to realize is that Philo did not create the Logos theology. With this, we also have to add in memra theology. The reason for this is that while logos means word in Greek, memra means word in Aramaic, and the views are quite similar. So there is so much more in play here, but we will get more into that in just a little bit. Before moving on, though, let's quickly touch on Justin Martyr. Justin does take Philo's view, but he radically transforms it. He makes Jesus into a divine hypostasis of God. Basically, he moves towards the idea of Jesus being one of the persons of the Trinity, but still distinct from God. He argues that Jesus is pre-existent and that he was the visible God of the Old Testament. His views contributed to Trinitarian thought. Now, he doesn't use the term Trinity, but what he is describing is kind of the framework of the Trinity that is merging out of all of this. And for Justin, there is just one God, and it is from this one God that Jesus emerges. Jesus is an extension of God, wrapped up in that identity. Dan's argument as a whole just doesn't make sense here.
We see it in Origen. We even see it in Eusebius, writing after the Council of Nicaea.
Sure, Origen and Eusebius used the ideas of Philo, and they changed those ideas drastically. And like Justin, they largely incorporated these ideas into a Trinitarian framework, a framework that supported the idea that there was one God. What Eusebius then does is actually take all of this and then claims that this is all ancient Jewish ideas. Eusebius, in a way, retrojects this more developed logos theology that is building into a Trinitarian viewpoint and retrojects that back into the time of Philo. None of these figures support the argument that Dan is trying to make, and instead show a clear development of Trinitarian ideas that incorporate a view of Philo's logos theology. There is still the view that there is only one God, that Jesus is divine and connected to the divinity of God in some way, but this really isn't fully developed. That would still take some time. But let's see what Dan has to say, and maybe he can make a real connection here.
And let's take a look at all of those writings to see if we can get a clearer understanding of what the author of the Gospel of John might be saying by referring to Jesus as the Logos and saying the Logos was theos, without the definite article, was deity, was divine, was a God.
This is misguided. Unless you can show that there's a connection between Philo and John, then you can't necessarily gain more understanding here. Unless John is utilizing the logos theology of Philo, that theology simply is not going to really matter. We can't simply assume that John is building or being influenced by Philo. When we compare their ideas of the logos, we also see that they diverge quite a bit. And again, we have to realize that Philo didn't create the idea of the logos, and at the same time within the Aramaic tradition, we have this memra theology that is also developing. So to simply point at an idea within Philo and say, see, this is what John was saying, doesn't make any sense, especially if we lack a real connection. Now, looking at how later individuals interpreted John 1:1 can be useful. It can show us how this passage was interpreted throughout history and thus actually shine a light on its meaning. We do have to be somewhat careful here though, because bad interpretations can sometimes take hold and really become dominant. But as long as we are careful, it actually has some potential. But before we get there, let's look at Philo.
So we're going to start with Philo in a text called On Dreams. Now, in this particular passage, Philo is talking about Genesis 31:13, where God appears to Jacob. In the Septuagint, it says, I am the God who appeared to you in the place of God.
Philo is dealing with the paradox, which just so happens to be something that we see within, well, Trinitarian thought as well. There's a paradox. The paradox is based on the fact that for Jews, there's only one God. Philo makes this clear. Truly, God is one. Yet we have this weird passage that talks about God who appeared in the place of God. The reason for this is because God the Father, the one true God, is invisible, is incomprehensible. We simply can't see God, at least according to Philo. Yet as with this passage and others, we have claims that people did in fact see God. So instead we get the visible God. Here, the Logos, an extension of God who is called God because he represents God. It's a paradox that Philo is trying to work through. But this paradox only exists because for Philo, there is just one God, and that true God is not visible. So he needs to explain something deeper. How can God be transcendent, but also immanent at different times?
So for Philo, the Logos is not the God of Israel, but it can bear the title theos as long as it doesn't have the definite article to indicate that it is kind of a secondary God.
Again, sure, the Logos, even in John, is not God the Father. That is never their claim. That's a strawman idea. So the argument is completely irrelevant because the claim isn't that Jesus or the Logos is God the Father. It's seen as an extension of God. Because for people like Philo, for Paul, for John, there is just one God.
In fact, Philo explicitly refers to the Logos as a second God.
And Dan here takes that out of context in order to try to further the conclusion he has already settled on. This in no way, shape, or form implies anything like polytheism. For Philo, God is one. He clearly states that in the passage and on dreams. For Philo, there is just one God. So when he talks about a second God, he's not talking about a second deity, some independent being that would be called a God. Philo is trying to solve a core problem. The Bible describes how God appeared to multiple individuals, but then we have this idea that no, God can't appear to people. No one has seen his face. And then on top of all of this, Philo adds some Greek philosophical ideas that speak of God as being invisible and the like. Both ideas can't be true unless something else is at play. That something for Philo is the Logos. The Logos for Philo is not a rival deity. It's not an independent God. It's a manifestation of the one true God. It's an extension of God, the visible God. None of this is separated from God the Father, but it's still distinct in some fashion. We can see this more like a second tier of God. The first tier is the true one God, the God who is invisible, incomprehensible, fully transcendent. The second tier, which is still God, is an extension of the tier one God, is more accessible, is more immanent. It's one true God, but there are different tiers of this one God. And yes, it's confusing, it's complex, and it's wrapped up in mystery, but these are ideas that are trying to explain the concepts and ideas that were already there, but there was a struggle to really define it all. So second God here doesn't imply in any way that the Logos was a second independent God. It's still part of the one true God.
So the Logos theology that the author of the Gospel of John is most likely building upon is probably informed by Philo's position.
Where is the evidence for that? Because they both use the idea of the Logos? Sure, we could say that both John and Philo are drawing from the same Jewish-based pool of ideas, but when we look at how John portrays the Logos, it is radically different from how Philo does that. And in fact, Philo probably would have looked at John's view as being impossible and possibly even impious. Now, sure, there are some similarities, which happens when you take from the same pool of ideas. It's why we see similarities with memra theology as well, which was developing in another tradition. But there are some massive differences. For instance, John makes the Logos a person. It's a human who dwelt among us. John also gets rid of the hierarchy that Philo has. John's view is much more fluid in that it also incorporates this father-son dynamic. John also has the Logos being worshipped as well as suffering. The differences are major. Even if we would assume that John did know of Philo and took Philo's ideas, he so greatly transformed the concept of the Logos to make all that really largely irrelevant. It would make it nonsensical for us to simply look at Philo and state that John believed the same thing, because he clearly didn't. Just because two people use the same idea, that doesn't mean they are connected. Dan would actually have to show an actual influence here, some type of connection, and show why that influence mattered and wasn't fully transformed into something else. Since Dan does not actually do that, we can just simply reject his idea here because there really doesn't seem to be a true connection.
That when you're talking about the God of Israel, you include the definite article. When you're talking about another deity, or when you're talking about an entity who can be referred to as divine or as deity or as a God, but is distinct from and subordinate to the very God of Israel, you omit the article, and that clarifies for the readership or those hearing that this is not a reference to the very God of Israel.
And all of this is completely irrelevant. First, Dan didn't show that John was developing his view off of Philo. He didn't show that John was taking the same idea as Philo. He simply pointed to Philo and said, well, he uses the idea of Logos as well, so, well, they must be connected. And thus what Philo has to say, that applies to John, which is, well, nonsense. The reason that it's nonsense is because it ignores the fact that John diverges so radically from the ideas that Philo had, that we can't really even be sure that they were connected in any meaningful way, besides them both taking from the same pool of ideas. And even then again, John transforms this idea of the Logos so much that we can't simply assume that he had the same ideas regarding all of this as Philo does. That's a huge leap of logic that simply isn't supported by the data or the scholarship on this subject. Beyond that, it also ignores the fact that Philo still had the view that there was only one God. Dan completely misrepresents that view and instead tries to allow the view that Philo may have been open to having other deities, a view Philo completely rejects. Beyond that, again, Dan continues to operate within this strawman view, because no one was attempting to say that the Logos was God the Father. That was never the argument. It's always that the Logos, Jesus, was God in some sense, that he was an extension of God that was distinct but still the same. Simply, Dan doesn't have a legitimate argument here. It's one that's trying to connect dots simply because they look vaguely familiar if you ignore all the details.
Let's take a look at someone writing a few decades after the Gospel of John. This is Justin Martyr's text, Dialogue with Trypho. And one of the things that Justin Martyr is trying to do is establish that the Word and the angel of the Lord are references to the pre-incarnate Jesus.
Yeah, because Justin was of the view that Jesus was God in some sense, even if he wasn't God the Father, and his attempt to connect all these facets of God helped build the foundation for the formalized and developed Trinitarian view. Justin here is literally forming the foundation of Trinitarian thought based on the ideas that there is only one God, and that God has different extensions which are distinct but also are still equal to God in some sense. He, like many others, are attempting to work through the paradox that existed. But let's see what Dan has to say.
And we have here, from Scripture I shall attempt to prove my assertion, namely, that there exists and is mentioned in Scripture another God and Lord under the Creator of all things, who is also called an angel because he proclaims to man whatever the Creator of the world, above whom there is no other God, wishes to reveal to them.
This is called cherry picking, and we covered the idea already with Philo. Justin in no way thought there was another independent God. For him, there was only one God. God the Father was the source of all divine. We then have the Logos, who is the Son, Jesus, who is distinct from the Father, but is the visible God of the Old Testament. He can be worshipped, he can be called God, all because he is God in some sense. It's this second tier idea once again. He's taking a monotheistic view, but he has to struggle with the appearance of God in the Old Testament, and thus he's working through that idea. He's keeping the concept of God the Father, who is transcendent, but then he's explaining how this God could also be immanent, meaning that he was here with us. He does this by stating that Jesus, the Logos, is God in some sense, that he is an extension of God. This is what the majority of scholars say, and since Dan seems to rely on the majority view, he has to deal with it. You can't simply appeal to the authority when it fits you, but not even address it when it's challenging. This is also what happens when you take what Justin has to say seriously instead of quote mining.
And then a little further down we have, then I said, let us return to the Scriptures, and I shall try to convince you that he who is said to have appeared to Abraham, Jacob, and Moses, and is called God, and by the way, that's anarthros, that is God without the definite article, is distinct from God the Creator, and there God has the definite article. Distinct, that is, in number, but not in mind.
So as I have been saying, Justin saw Jesus as distinct from God, but also in some fashion equal or the same as God. Now Dan is going to have to try to rationalize this part out, and we will see that in a moment. But the big problem here is that he is again acting as if missing a definite article really means something of importance here. He's cherry picking instances that he thinks fits his view and ignoring other examples. And we have to remember, as we already discussed, that it is not uncommon to drop the definite article in various cases. So it's a non-argument to begin begin with, as the grammar here isn't as clear-cut as Dan tries to make it, and cherry-picking instances where he sees something similar doesn't really add anything to the discussion, because what's happening is that he's just pointing to places where the definite article could be dropped because of the grammatical rules that are in play. What Dan also fails to realize here is that Justin is attempting to build a larger argument. The entire argument is really foundational work for the Trinity. It's an argument that looks at God, who is transcendent, is invisible, and how that one God can also be immanent, can be visible. What Justin is doing is providing so-called proofs that continue to build on this idea of different extensions of God. They all go back to God, but they are distinct from God in some manner. He's arguing for a Jewish monotheistic view, as Trypho, who he's having this supposed conversation with, is Jewish, but he's also expanding a Jewish view to incorporate Christ. This is the goal that Justin gets to in the next 10 chapters of his work. But let's see how Dan navigates around the term mind here.
And the word there for mind is gnomi, and this is sometimes incorrectly translated essence by folks who want to read Trinitarianism into Justin's text.
Okay, it means mind. We don't need it to mean essence. I'd agree that that reading is incredible, but we still have Justin equating Jesus or the Logos with God. And when we read the next 10 chapters, this is a point that continually is built upon. And when we look at all of this as a whole, what we see is some of the foundational ideas that get incorporated into the Trinity. So yeah, this one word in and of itself doesn't prove a Trinitarian view that is being built. But when Justin is read as a whole, we begin seeing that this foundation of the Trinitarian idea is in fact being built. Now let's be clear here. Justin himself was not a Trinitarian. Instead, he was more of a binitarian. He's working with 2 facets as opposed to 3. He largely leaves the Holy Spirit out of the equation here. And if we want to look at the majority of scholars, well, they agree that Justin is a binitarian thinker whose views were later developed further and incorporated into the Trinitarian view that we have today. The argument here just doesn't add anything, and it ignores the entire context of what Justin is doing.
In other words, the Logos is under the God of Israel.
Yeah, we've covered this before, so I'm not going to really beat a dead horse, but the argument was never that Jesus was the exact same as God the Father. The argument has always been there's some distinction here. This is why I continue to call Dan's argument a straw man. He's arguing for something most Trinitarians would not agree with. Jesus is not God the Father. Now here's where things get interesting, because if we actually continue reading Justin here, the next 10 chapters, what we get is Justin arguing that when Abraham or Moses or the like are talking to God, or when we have God claiming, I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that is actually Jesus, Christ. So we have the equation here. Yes, Jesus, being an extension of God, is still subordinate to the one true God. There's still some distinction, but there's also this sense that they are still one in some manner. They are separate, but also not, which is exactly the view of the Trinity.
And then we have further on, chapter 61.
Shortly before this, in chapter 59, Justin just got done arguing that Christ, or what he will eventually argue is Christ, is the being, the person, who revealed to Moses that he is the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. This is just part of Justin's argument that this same one is both angel and God and Lord and man. This one is who appeared to Abraham and Isaac and appeared to Moses in a flaming bush, who conversed with Moses. Chapter 60 expands on this idea by discussing how Moses conversed with God. And here again, Justin equates this same one who is an angel and who is God is the one who Moses spoke with. This one that Justin is talking about is Christ. So Justin is already forming this binitarian view here, and he's equating multiple ideas while also keeping some separation. When we get to chapter 61, Justin is building on this idea. But before we get there, Justin argues that when Genesis 35:7 states that I am the God that appeared to you when you fled from the face of Esau, your brother, well, that was Christ. If someone saw God in the Hebrew scripture, Justin is stating, Well, that was Christ. Justin is really stressing this point. Chapter 61 is just expanding on this, and Justin does this by equating the Holy Spirit, the glory of the Lord, the Son, wisdom, an angel, God, Lord, and Logos, or even Captain. Those are all things which refer to the one, which is Christ, who was begotten by God and proceeds from God. He makes this connection ever more clear by stating that God begot Jesus through an act of will, which Justin argues remains within God as well. Justin gives an example of a fire here. He states that a fire is not lessened when it was kindled by another, but it still remains the same. Expanding, he states that while this new fire appears to exist itself, that doesn't diminish that from which it was started. Justin is building an argument here that connects God and Christ. Yes, they are still different, but they are also somewhat the same. Let's see how Dan actually deals with this, though.
Notice Justin does not say he is God. He says he can lay claim to the title, the anarthrous title, theos, so deity, because he is born of an act of the Father's will, and the fact that he performs the Father's will. He is united with the Father in will and intention.
Dan stops his reading right before Justin gets into describing how Jesus comes from God and how he remains the same as God. This is the whole fire analogy that Justin gives. Justin also explains this through the act of giving out some word. We beget the word, but the word also remains in us. Dan stops short of Justin's explanation of what it means for God to beget Jesus through an act of will. Dan only quotes half the argument and leaves out the actual explanation. Maybe the reason why is because the explanation speaks about how Justin believes that Christ still remains the same as God, even though he's also distinct, because that's the point Justin is making here. Dan's real argument here is pretty convoluted. It seems to be, well, we don't have a definite article before theos, so Justin isn't saying God, big G here, even though the context of all this makes it clear that Justin is in fact talking about God, and he in fact says God. But since it's missing that article, which it wasn't uncommon to drop the article in a grammatical structure like this, we have to simply conclude that Justin is talking about deity in general instead of what he's actually talking about. Simply, the argument that Dan is making is a joke, as it only works if you ignore the context and then demand a Greek grammatical rule that doesn't exist. Only then can you get to the reading that Dan has here. It's the same sort of apologetic nonsense that he argues against so often.
So, Jesus is a separate, distinct being who can be referred to as the anarthrous God, in other words, as divine, as deity, as a God, but he is not God over all. He is not the creator of the universe. He is not God the Father. He is not the God of Israel.
Again, yes, Jesus is separate from God the Father. The Trinity does not claim that Jesus is the same as God the Father. It states that he is not God the Father. He is God the Son. He is distinct from God. That's a key concept in the Trinity. So Dan just continues to repeat the straw man. He then repeats a flawed grammatical argument based on a missing article, something that is common within Greek. We can look at Mark 1:1 here, where we have the phrase Son of God. We are missing the article here. Does that mean that we're talking about a son of a God? No. Context still matters. If we look at this section as a whole, Justin is making an argument that in part states that when God appears in the Hebrew scripture, when he appeared in the burning bush, that was Christ. Justin is making a distinction here, but he's not saying that Christ is an independent God or just some deity. In fact, in chapter 61, in the section Dan didn't read, Justin states they are still the same even though they appear different. With all of this in mind, we can't read this as Justin simply saying, well, Christ is just some God. No. Justin has made it clear there is one God, and Christ extends from that God. This is why we see the distinction with the use of an article. For God the Father, he uses the article. For Jesus, for Christ, he skips the article, but he still means it as God, not a God, because for Justin there were no other gods. It's theological grammar. This is what most scholars argue, and yes, I'm going to keep bringing that up because it just shows how Dan is okay with rejecting the scholarship when it disagrees with him, but he will appeal to it when it fits his view. What we get though is Justin making Christ as divine, but still subordinate to the true God. Christ is God in a sense, but he's not God the Father. He shares in God's divinity, but he's also separate. It's a binitarian view. So yes, Christ is not God the Father. He is still distinct from God the Father, but he's wrapped up in the divinity of God, is the same as God in some way, and in fact in chapter 64 of Justin, he's equated in some sense, quite literally, to the God of Israel. Dan is cherry picking here.